Heartless millionaire kicks his wife out of the house because she can't have children. 7 years later, he's shocked to see his ex-wife with twins, who look exactly like him. The Blackwood estate was cloaked in an eerie kind of quiet, the kind that wasn't peaceful but oppressive. Ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor marked the passing minutes like a judge announcing a sentence. Alexander Blackwood sat in the library, his broad shoulders hunched as stared at a tumbler-off untouched bourbon. On the mahogany desk before him, the fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth failing to reach the cold knot tightening in his chest. His mother's words from that morning echoed in his mind, sharp and unyielding. "She's barren, Alexander. Do you understand what that means for this family, for the Blackwood name? It's time to end this charade before it costs you everything." Everything. Margaret Blackwood, regal and unbending, had stood before him like a figure carved from ice. She hadn't raised her voice. She never needed to. Her words sliced through the air with precision designed to cut, not wound. "You're the head of this family," Nosh continued, each syllable deliberate. "A Blackwood doesn't cling to dead weight, especially not a girl from nowhere with no bloodline, no connections, and no heirs." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Alina Hart is my wife." Margaret had waved her manicured hand dismissively, her diamond bracelet catching the morning light. "And she's had 3 years to fulfill her role. Don't have a single child. How much longer are you willing to let this continue before it ruins you?" Ruins us. Alexander felt the pressure of his mother's expectations crushing him like a vice. He clenched his fists until the knuckles whitened, but the trembling in his hands betrayed him. Alina Hart hummed softly as she folded laundry in the small sitting room, sunlight streaming through the bay window. The soft notes of her voice filled the space, weaving a fragile piece into the fabric of the day. She glanced at the clock, her expression softening. Alexander would be home soon. Her hands moved rhythmically, but her mind wandered. She thought of the way Alexander used to smile at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners like he couldn't contain his joy. Lately, that smile had become scarce, replaced by attention. She didn't know how to soothe the weight of their unspoken failures. Particularly hers hovered between them like a specter. The door creaked open, and Alexander's footsteps echoed down the hall. She looked up, her heart quickening with both relief and apprehension. He hesitated in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the dim light of the corridor. "You're home early." Alina Hart said, her tone light but tinged with nervousness. She sat down, the shirt had been folding, and wiped her hands on her apron. "I was thinking we could." Alina Hart, his voice was low, almost a whisper, but it stopped her mid-sentence. She froze, her smile faltering. Alexander stepped into the room, his gaze darting to the floor as if he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. His hands found the back of a chair, gripping it tightly. The silence stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice strained, "about us." Her brows knit together, and she stepped closer. "Alexander, what's wrong?" The tenderness in her voice, which had once grounded him, now twisted him with guilt. He forced himself to look at her, her delicate features the-way. Her hair fell softly over her shoulders, her eyes full of concern. "I think we need to separate." The words dropped like stones into the fragile stillness of the room. For a moment, Alina Hart didn't move, didn't breathe. Her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. "What?" she finally whispered, her voice cracking. "Why are you saying this?" Alexander's throat tightened. He struggled to express the truth to her, realizing that his mother's ultimatum had compelled him to act, and his love for her was insufficient to overcome the burden of the Blackwood name. Instead, he leaned into the lie that had been rehearsed in his head, though it tasted like ash on his tongue. "This isn't working, Alina Hart. It's been 3 years, and we're not building the life we hoped for." Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Alexander, we can fix this. We can." "It's not something we can fix," he interrupted, his voice harder than he tended. "It's just over." Alina Hart's breath hitched, and she stepped back as if he had struck her. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, the place where life had never taken root. The gesture made Alexander's chest itch, but he didn't reach for her. The clock chimed softly, a cruel reminder of time slipping away. Alina Hart finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Is this because of me?" "Because I know," he said quickly, too quickly. "It's just what has to be. She stood there, her frame fragile yet unbroken. If you walk away from me, Alexander, I don't think I'll ever forgive you. Alexander swallowed hard, the weight of her words crashing over him, but had turned away, his steps heavy as he left the room. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the house like the final note of a funeral dirge. In the empty silence that followed, Elena Hart sank into the chair he had gripped moments earlier. The warmth of his touch lingered on the wood, a cruel reminder of what she had lost. The storm outside the Blackwood estate mirrored the cows in Elena Hart's chest. Rain lashed against the tall windows, streaking the glass like tears. She stood in her small suitcase by her feet, trembling fingers wrapped around the handle. Alexander was perched on the edge of the staircase, his back rigid as if the banister behind him held him upright. He avoided her gaze, staring somewhere beyond her shoulder. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. Alexander, Elena Hart's voice broke soft and raw. Please, just tell me why. His jaw tightened, a slight movement that revealed the tension coiled within him. He didn't answer. 3 years, Alexander, her words spilled out shaky but unrelenting. 3 years of a marriage you promised would stand against anything. You stood right there. She gestured toward the grand archway where they'd exchanged vows, and you told me we'd face every storm together, and now you're— her voice cracked, faltering under the weight of her grief. Now you're asking me to leave. It's better this way, he muttered, still refusing to look at her. His tone was clipped and cold, and it struck her like a slap. Better for who? She whispered at her breath. Hitching for your mother, for your legacy. What about us, Alexander? What about me? When he finally raised his gaze to hers, the steel in his gaze did not mitigate the impact. This isn't about anyone else, Elena Hart. This is about what's right. Elena Hart staggered back a step, her chest tightening as if the air had been stolen from the room. She scanned his face, desperate to find some trace of the man she had loved, the man who had once made her laugh so hard she cried, who had held her hand like it was the most sacred thing in the world. But he was gone, buried under the weight of expectations she couldn't fight. Right, she repeated the word, dripping with bitterness. Her hands shook as she reached for the suitcase, lifting it with an effort that felt heavier than its hold. Have, if this is what you call right, then you've lost far more than just me, Alexander. Her heels clicked against the polished marble as she moved toward the door. She paused, turning back one last time. Her gaze lingered on the man she had given everything to, her voice soft but resolute. You'll regret this. As she stepped outside, the rain welcomed her with a cold slap. Her thin cardigan offered little protection against the elements, and the wind bit at her cheek, sending shivers down her spine. The suitcase banged against her legs as she trudged down the driveway, the grand Blackwood estate looming behind her like a hollow shell. Elena Hart didn't look back. The train rumbled as it crossed into the Chicago city limits, its wheels humming a rhythm that seemed to echo her thoughts. Elena Hart stared out the window, her reflection blurred against the rain-slicked glass. The city's towering skyline loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the overcast sky. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, the weight of the small life she had packed pressing into her palm. It was all she had now: a few clothes, a worn photo of her wedding day tucked into the pocket of a coat she couldn't bring herself to wear anymore, and a growing ache in her chest. The train pulled into the station with a metallic groan. Passengers bustled around her, brushing pastel in a flurry of umbrellas and hurried steps. Elena Hart remained seated for a moment, her breath shallow, her pulse thudding in her ears. Mum. A conductor's polite voice jolted her. This is the last stop. She nodded quickly, standing on unsteady legs. The platform was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of wet concrete, and the faint tang of diesel. She followed the crowd into the city, her steps uncertain but deliberate. Elena Hart wandered through the unfamiliar streets of Chicago, the weight of her loneliness pressing down with every step. Theater-wearing buildings seemed to swallow her, their shadows casting her into a sea of strangers. With shaking hands, she found a modest hotel off a quieter street and paid for a week's stay. The room was small, its walls a faded beige, but it was warm and dry. She dropped her suitcase by the bed and sank onto the mattress, her head falling into her hands. The tears came slowly at first, then All at once her body shaking with the force of her sobs, the enormity of what she had lost washed over her, drowning her in waves of grief and exhaustion. But as the night wore on, a strange stillness settled over her ears dried, leaving only the faint tremor in her chest. She lay back on Thebes, staring at the cracked ceiling, her breathing steadying. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow, I'll figure it out. The city outside hummed with life, its heartbeat steady and relentless for the first time in weeks. Elena Hart let herself close her eyes, holding on to the smallest flicker of resilience. She was still here, and that, for now, was enough. Elena Hart stirred awake to a dull ache in her temples, the faint hum of city noise seeping through the paper-thin hotel walls. The sunlight that filtered in through the faded curtains felt sharp against her swollen eyes. She sat up slowly, her body heavy, her mind heavier. Yesterday's storm, both literal and emotional, still lingered in her bones. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, planting her feet on the cold floor. The mirror above the dresser reflected someone she barely recognized. Hollow eyes, disheveled hair, and a teeth that made her look like a ghost. But as she stared, something flickered in her gaze, a trace of defiance, faint but present. She pulled on her cardigan and decided to take the first step toward rebuilding her life. The nausea hit her a week later. It wasn't sudden, but it came off in waves of unease, rising in her stomach each morning. At first, Elena Hart dismissed it as stress, or the consequence of days spent eating little more than crackers and tea from a nearby diner. But as the dizziness persisted, a gnawing thought crept into her mind. One she was too afraid to name. The confirmation came in form of a doctor's soft matter OFA voice. "Miss, you're pregnant. In fact, you're expecting twins." Elena Hart froze, her hands gripping the edges of the chair, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. The small, sterile room felt suddenly too bright, too confined. She didn't answer right away, letting the doctor's words settle like ripples on a pond. Twins. The word felt surreal, both adjective and a burden. "Are you all right, Miss?" the doctor asked gently, his brows furrowed with concern. She nodded slowly, the knot in her throat tightening. "Yes," she whispered. I just need a moment." She walked out of the clinic, clutching the thin sheet of paper that listed her due date and basic health instructions. The cold January wind whipped around her butt. Elena Hart barely felt it. Fear, joy, and a fierce resolve simmered beneath her thoughts. She stopped by the park, finding a bench dusted with snow. Sitting down, she set her fingers over the paper, her breath puffing in the frigid air. Alexander's face flashed in her mind, his cold detachment, his clipped words. He would never know he had forfeited the right to for her unborn children. She resolved that the Blackwood name and everything it stood for would never touch them. Elena Hart threw herself into building a new life. She found a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, just big enough to accommodate a crib. When the time came, the building was old, the walls thin enough to hear her neighbors arguing, but it was hers. She worked at a local cafe, long shifts that left her feet aching, but her wallet marginally fuller. It was there that she first met Ethan Lawson, a regular customer with a kind smile who tipped generously and always asked how she was holding up. She was polite, but guarded her focus entirely on survival and the growing lives inside her. By the third trimester, her belly was round and heavy, and her movements slower. She spent evenings knitting small sweaters she hoped would keep her twins warm in the Chicago winters. The routine of it, simple, methodical, steadied her in ways shackled and explained. The labor came in the early hours of a cold April morning. Elena Hart woke with a start, her breath hitching as pain rippled through her body. The next hours were a blur of sharp contractions, rushing to the hospital in a cab, and the antiseptic smell of the delivery room. "Push, Elena Hart," the nurse urged, her voice steady. "You're almost there." Elena Hart clenched her teeth, tears cascading down her cheeks as she delivered. A final pushed, piercing cry of a baby filled the room, and then another. The sound was raw, life affirming. She collapsed back against the pillows, her chest heaving, as the nurse gently placed two swaddled bundles in her arms. Two identical faces stared upon her, their tiny features soft and delicate. Cole and Owen she had chosen names quietly in the stillness of her apartment long before this moment. No. Seeing them, they felt perfect. She traced a finger along Cole's tiny cheek, then Owen's tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't from Painthy, were from love so overwhelming, it made her chest ache. "I'll protect you," she whispered, her voice trembling. No matter what. Back in her apartment a week later, the three of them settled into a rhythm. It wasn't easy: sleepless nights, endless bottles to prepare, and the constant hum of exhaustion. But Elena's heart persevered. The boys' laughter, even in its infant form, became her anchor each night. As she held them close, she found herself repeating, "This'll make we it, promise you'll never know the pain I did," she murmured, her voice steady. Even when her heart wavered, "You'll grow up free from all of it." Her love for Cole and Owen became her purpose, her drive, and her redemption. And in their presence, she began to feel whole again. The Blackwood ballroom glimmered with opulence, yet it filled hollow crystal chandeliers, cast a warm glow over the gathered elite, their laughter and polite chatter echoing off the marble floors. Alexander Blackwood stood at the altar, his posture stiff, his face carefully neutral. Beside him, Serena Whitfield, a vision in silk and lace, smiled faintly, her beauty cold and calculated like a porcelain doll made to be admired, but never touched. The efficient voice droned on, but Alexander's mind wandered. He barely registered the words binding him to this new life, each syllable a chain tightening around his chest. His gaze flitted to his mother, Margaret, seated in front row. She was radiant, her eyes gleaming with triumph. As she nodded approvingly, this was her victory, not his. Serena's hand slipped into his, cool and weightless. Alexander forced himself to look at her, murmuring the vows he had rehearsed. The room erupted in applause as they exchanged rings, but the sound felt distant, muted. The kiss they shared was brief and devoid of passion, a hollow gesture for the sake of appearances. Later at the reception, Alexander stood by the grand fireplace, a glass of champagne in hand. He stared at the flames, their warmth failing to reach him. Around him, guests mingled, offering congratulations that felt more like obligations. Serena flitted between conversations, her laughter polite but strained. She caught his eye briefly, her smile faltering before she turned away. Alexander took a long sip of his drink, the bitterness burning his throat. His thoughts drifted to Elena Hart. He pictured her the way she had looked the last time he saw her, rain-soaked, her suitcase in hand, her eyes filled with heartbreak. The memory clawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Regret wouldn't change the path he had chosen. Margaret was completely comfortable in her surroundings. She moved through the room with practiced ease, basing in the compliments of her peers. A perfect match, they said. Blackwoods and the Whitfields, what a union. Her lips curved into a satisfied smile as she glanced at Alexander and Serena, standing side by side like chess pieces at expertly positioned. But her satisfaction was short-lived. Serena gave birth to a baby girl 9 months later. The nurseries, filled with anticipation, grew cold as Margaret's disappointment became clear. Hazel Serena had named her the name chosen without Margaret's input. Margaret's reaction was subtle but biting. A daughter, she said, her voice carefully measured. "Well, at least she's beautiful." Serena stiffened, cradling Hazel closer. "She's perfect," she replied, her tone edged with defiance. Margaret offered a tight smile, but her dissatisfaction was evident. Hazel wasn't there. She had envisioned. Margaret's subtle criticisms grew sharper over time. Comments about Hazel's delicate health, her temperament, even the way Serena parented, only fleeting glances and clipped conversations revealed the simmering tension beneath the surface. Alexander, meanwhile, found himself adrift. His days were consumed by the routines of his family's business, his nights by the emptiness of his home. The marriage to Serena was polite but distant. They spoke in pleasantries, their interactions careful and controlled. Serena, he realized, was as much a prisoner of this union as he was in the quiet hours. Alexander's mind wandered back to Elena Hart. He often found himself reaching for the drawer in his office where a single photograph lay hidden. It was from their honeymoon. Elena Hart, laughing, her hair windswept, her eyes bright with joy. He would trace his thumb over her image, each in his chest, sharpening with each glance. He wondered where she was doing. Did she hate him? Was she happy? The questions haunted him, their answers out of reach. One night as he sat alone in the study, Hazel's cries echoed faintly down the hall. Serena's soothing voice followed, soft but weary. Alexander stared into his glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light his life, he realized, was a carefully curated facade. The legacy his mother had demanded he protect felt like a gilded cage, each golden bar forged from choices heckled and undo. He stood the photograph still in his hand and walked to the window. The city lights sprawled out before him, a reminder of all the possibilities he had forsaken. Somewhere out there she was living a life beyond his reach. The thought both comforted and tormented him. Alexander pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging the pain. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the night. Though no one was there to hear, the Blackwood mansion maintained its grandeur. Yet the fissures beneath its exterior widened daily. Margaret's iron grip on the family began to falter as Serena grew more defiant, deterred to shield Hazel from her mother-in-law's cutting expectations. Alexander drifted further into himself, his regrets festering like an old wound, and in the shadows of his gilded life the memory of Elena Hart burned like a quiet flame, a reminder of what he had lost and what heckled never reclaimed. The small cafe near the edge of Chicago's bustling downtown had become Elena Hart's second home. Its chipped tables and mismatched chairs were far from glamorous, but the steady rhythm of the work gave her a sense of control. Behind the counter, the hiss of the espresso machine mingled with the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional laugh from a customer. It was a morning like any other when Ethan Lawson first walked in. Elena Hart was at the register, a smudge of flour on her apron from handling pastries. She barely glanced up as the tall man in a navy coat placed his order. "Just black coffee, please," he said, his voice warm but direct. Elena Hart nodded, punching the order into the old cash register. She glanced up as she handed him his change, catching the faint trace of a smile that seemed more genuine than most. Alexander drifted further into himself, his regrets festering like an old wound, and in the shadows of his gilded life the memory of Elena Hart burned like a quiet flame, a reminder of what he had lost and what he could never reclaim. The small cafe near the edge of Chicago's bustling downtown had become Elena Hart's second home. Its chipped tables and mismatched chairs were far from glamorous, but the steady rhythm of work gave her a sense of control. Behind the counter, the hiss of the espresso machine mingled with the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional laugh from a customer. It was a morning like any other when Ethan Lawson first walked in. Elena Hart was at the register, a smudge of flour on her apron from handling pastries. She barely glanced up as the tall man in a navy coat placed his order. "Just a black coffee, please," he said, his voice warm but direct. Elena Hart nodded, punching the order into the old cash register. She glanced up as she handed him his change, catching the faint trace of a smile that seemed more genuine than most. "Thanks," he said, his eyes lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Elena Hart offered a polite nod, then turned her attention to the next customer. Ethan Lawson sat near the window, pulling out a small notebook as steam from his coffee curled upward. Their paths crossed again a week later, this time under less mundane circumstances. Elena Hart was at the playground with Cole and Owen, the twins, giggling as they toddled after each other in the damp grass. A sharp cry broke the peace as Cole tripped, falling face first onto the ground. "Cole!" Elena Hart rushed to him, scooping him up. Blood trickled from a small cut on his knee, and his wails grew louder. Panic bubbled in her chest. She had nothing but a tissue in her pocket, and no idea how to properly clean the wound. Here came a familiar voice. She turned to see Ethan Lawson jogging toward Thema, small first SD kit in hand. He crouched down his coat, brushing the ground as he opened the kit with practiced ease. "I'm a doctor," he explained, glancing up briefly as he pulled out an antiseptic wipe. "May I?" Elena Hart hesitated, then nodded. Ethan Lawson cleaned the wound with gentle precision, murmuring softly to Cole to distract him. "There we go, all better," he said, securing a bandage in place. Cole's sobs had subsided into hiccups, his tear-streaked face now full of curiosity as he stared at Ethan Lawson. "Thank you," Elena Hart said quietly, her voice edged with both gratitude and exhaustion. Ethan Lawson stood, brushing off his knees. "It's no trouble. I work at the clinic down the street. I see little ones like this all the time." Over the weeks that followed, Ethan Lawson's presence became acquiescent, but steady part of Elena Hart's life. He stopped by the cafe regularly sometimes with a book tucked under his arm, sometimes with a small gift for the boys, coloring books, toy cars, things Heckland were just lying around. Elena Hart found herself talking to him more. Their conversations light and unassuming. At first they talked about Chicago winters, best coffee spots in the city, and the occasional chaos of raising toddlers. Ethan Lawson listened more than he spoke, his questions thoughtful and his slaughter easy. One day as they sat outside during a rare warm afternoon, Ethan Lawson leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You've built something special here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the cafe and the bustling street. "It's not easy raising two boys on your own." Elena Hart's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. She gave a small shrug, her voice guarded. "You do what you have to." Ethan Lawson didn't press, sensing the wall had quietly erected. Instead, he shifted the conversation, telling her about his time working in a small rural hospital and the quirks of his patients there. Elena Hart found herself smiling despite herself, the tension easing from her shoulders. Ethan Lawson's affection for Elena Hart grew in this small moment when she carefully tucked a blanket around a sleeping Owen at the cafe, or when her laugh, rare but genuine, lit up her face. But he never said anything, aware of the guardedness in her every gesture. The way she avoided speaking about her past. One evening, as they walked back from the park with the twins, Ethan Lawson spoke softly. "You know, Elena Hart, you don't always have to carry everything alone." She stopped, her hands tightening in the stroller handle. The streetlights cast a soft glow on her face, and for a moment she didn't respond. "It's not about carrying it alone," she said finally, her voice steady but distant. "It's about knowing you can't drop it." Ethan Lawson didn't push, but the look he gave her was one of quiet understanding. They continued walking in silence, the twins babbling softly to each other in the stroller. Elena Hart appreciated Ethan Lawson's presence, but she couldn't allow herself to lean on him, no matter how much easier it might make things. Her scars ran too deep, her trust too fragile. Yet, as weeks turned into months, she found herself looking forward to their conversations, their quiet moments of companionship. Ethan Lawson never pried, never pushed. He was there, steady and patient like the tide. And while Elena Hart's heart remained guarded, a small part of her began to wonder if perhaps she didn't have to face the world entirely alone. The windy city greeted Alexander Blackwood with its characteristic blend of noise, steel, and endless motion. He stepped off that train with his briefcase in hand, the worn leather, a testament to years of business trips and negotiations. Chicago wasn't unfamiliar, but this time its streets felt different. The towering buildings seemed more oppressive, the bustling crowds a stark contrast to the isolation he carried within. He adjusted his tie, loosening it slightly as he checked his phone for itinerary. Margaret had meticulously curated a meeting with investors, a dinner with potential clients. The usual grind, the weight of expectation pressed against his chest, as suffocating as ever. Yet beneath it all was a hollow ache, a void that the success Margaret lorded could never fill. Later that afternoon, his meeting concluded earlier than expected. Alexander wandered through Millennium Park, his polished shoes incongruous against the worn concrete paths. The laughter of children rang out across the open spaces, their voices punctuated by the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of wind through budding trees. It was uncharacteristic of him to linger, but something about the park's energy stilled his typically restless mind. As he approached a bench near a playground, a flash of movement caught his eye. A woman crouched beside two young boys. They were laughing, their identical faces glowing with delight as they tussled over a toy truck. Alexander froze mid-step, his breath hitching. The woman turned her head slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her profile wasn't mystical, etched in his memory like an indelible mark. Elena Hart. 7 years have passed since she left. Alexander's chest tightened, his gaze darted to the boys again, their features no under closer scrutiny. His heart thudded against his ribs as realization struck their sandy brown hair, the sharp line of their jaws, even the way one boy furrowed his brows in concentration. It was as if he were looking at his own childhood photographs. Alexander retreated to a bench several yards away. Sitting heavily as he tried to steady his breath, observed the unfolding scene from the edge of his vision. Elena Hart laughed softly as she helped one boy zip his jacket, the other clinging to her. Her movements were fluid, practiced the gestures of a mother deeply attuned to her children's needs. Guilt clawed at him raw and relentless. He had done this. He had pushed her away, abandoned her to a world where she'd had to face this alone, and yet here she was, resilient and radiant in a way he didn't deserve to witness. He felt like an intruder, his presence an unwelcome shadow in her sunlit world. Curiosity would at him, relentless and insidious. How had she ended up here? Had she ever thought of him and the boys? Were they his? The following days found Alexander distracted, his work a blur of half-hearted conversations, hollow pleasantries. He returned to the park more than once, each time keeping his distance, watching Elena Hart from afar. He noticed the way she carried herself, her movements, confident but edged with a subtle caution. She spoke gently to the boys, her words laced with patience and warmth. One afternoon, Elena Hart called the boys toward a nearby cafe. Alexander followed at a careful distance, the sign above the door read Bean and Bee Brew, its chipped paint a stark contrast to the glossy coffee shops he frequented. Through the window he saw Elena Hart behind the counter, her apron tied snugly around her waist. As she handed a steaming mug to a customer, Alexander lingered outside, the chill in the air seeping into his skin. He couldn't bring himself to go, and the questions swirling in his mind felt too heavy, the confrontation too sudden. Instead, he resolved to uncover the truth. Another way. That evening back at Heartless, Alexander pored over documents he had requested through a private investigator. Reports were concise but revealing Elena Hart had moved to Chicago shortly after their separation, taking up modest work while raising two boys, Coley and Owen. Their ages aligned uncomfortably close to the timeline of their last days together. Alexander's fingers tightened around the edges of the paper. What do you think of Alexander, the character who is listening to this story? If you feel he is more pitiful, leave a comment saying matcha, and if you feel he's more blameworthy, leave a comment saying veiny. The truth was deniable. They wary he felt a heavy burden of regret. Images of their time together are fast. Elena Hart's laughter, her gentle touch, the way she had looked at him with unwavering trust. He had destroyed that trust, and in doing so he had missed 6 years of a life. He might have had the photo of Elena Hart with Cole and Owen that accompanied the report seemed to taunt him. The boys stood on either side of her, their grins wide, their eyes shining with the kind of joy that Alexander hadn't felt in years. Helen back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the hollow life he had built. His marriage to Serena, his role as the dutiful Blackwood heir, felt meaningless in face of this new reality. The next morning, Alexander found himself back at Thepperk. Elena Hart was there as usual, her boys chasing each other around the swings. This time, Alexander didn't stay in shadows. He took a step forward, his heart pounding, the weight of 7 years of guilt and longing pressing against his chest. Elena Hart, he called softly, shuddered, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, the laughter of children fading into the background. Alexander, she finally said, her voice steady but guarded, and just like that the past collided with the present. Their lives once again entwined in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Elena Hart stood frozen, her gaze locked on Alexander. The playground warmth, the laughter of children, the chatter of parents faded into a dull hue, clipped by the weight of his presence. He looked older, his once proud posture attempered by something softer, something broken. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp like a blade held ready. Alexander hesitated, his hand stuffed into the pockets of his coat. "I'm here for work," he said, his tone quiet. "I didn't expect." He glanced at Cole and Owen, who were now watching curiously from the swings. His voice faltered. "They're mine, aren't they?" Elena Hart's jaw tightened, her hands instinctively moving to her sides, shielding her sons from the weight of his words. "It doesn't matter," she said coldly. "You made your choice years ago." Alexander flinched at her tone, the guilt he'd been carrying swelling into something unbearable. "I didn't know Elena Hart, I didn't know about them. She moved forward, her voice reduced to a harsh whisper. You didn't know because you didn't care to ask. You threw me away like I was nothing, Alexander. And now after 7 years, you think you can just waltz back into my life? Alexander's gaze dropped to the ground. It wasn't like that, he murmured. The words felt hollow even to him. Oh, wasn't it? Elena Hart snapped, her voice rising, because from where I stood it was exactly like that. You chose your family, your legacy, and your precious image over me, over us. The raw pain in her words pierced Alexander more deeply than he expected. He struggled for something to say, some way to explain the years of silence, the regret that had gutted him every day since she left. I was wrong, Hesed finally, his voice trembling. I was weak and I'm sorry. Elena Hart's expression softened for a brief moment before hardening again. Sorry isn't enough, she said, her voice quieter now but no less resolute. Not after everything I've been through, not after everything they've been through. Alexander glanced at the boys again. Cole was whispering to Owen, their small faces a perfect mirror of his own childhood. I just want to be part of their lives, he said. I don't want to take them away from you, Elena Hart. I just want to be there. Her laugh was bitter, her head shaking. Be there, like you were there for me, like you were there when I was pregnant and terrified and completely alone. She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes narrowing. You don't get to swoop in now and act like some savior. Alexander took a step closer, his voice soft but insistent. I'm not asking to take over. I'm asking for a chance for them, for you. Elena Hart's lips tightened into a thin line. There is no us, Alexander. Not anymore. Eve moved on. The words hit him like a punch, and he stiffened. You're seeing Simeon, yes, she said, her tone unwavering. Ethan Lawson, he's kind, dependable, and he doesn't abandon the people he loves when things get hard. Alexander's jaw clenched. The name stung, not because he knew Ethan Lawson, but because it confirmed that Elena Hart had built a life without him, a life he had no part in. I'm glad, he said finally, though the words felt bitter in his mouth. But I still want to be there for Cole and Owen. Elena Hart's stance remained firm. You don't get to disrupt their lives because of your guilt. They're happy, Alexander. They have stability, love, and a home. What can you offer them? A father who walked away before they were even born. His chest tightened, but he refused to bat down a chance to know the truth, though. Know their father. Elena Hart sighed, her exhaustion permeating her resolve. And what happens when you go back to New York, back to your wife, your mother? Do you really think you can be the father they need while you're tangled in the life you chose? Alexander's face paled at her words, but he didn't falter. I just want to try, even if it's only as a friend. Please, Elena Hart. She studied him for a long moment, her heart wearing with itself. A part of her yearned to permanently close this chapter of her life. But there was another part, a smaller, quieter part, that still longed for some semblance of closure, for her boys to know their father, if only in fragments. Fine, she said. At last, her voice low and clipped, but on my terms, and the moment I think this is hurting them, you're gone. Alexander nodded, a wave of relief sweeping over him. Thank you, he whispered. Don't thank me, Elena Hart said sharply, turning to gather her boys. This isn't for you. Alexander stood motionless as she upped away. Cole and Owen gripping her hands tightly, the weight of his choice hung heavy around him. But for the first time in years he felt a spark of hope, small, tentative, and fragile, but there. Margaret Blackwood had never been wont to tolerate uncertainty. Information was her currency, and she had long mastered the art of unearthing secrets. The truth about Cole and Owen came to her through carefully placed whispers, an unnamed informant from Alexander's business dealings in Chicago. The news confirmed what she had long suspected. Alexander's departure from tradition had not been without consequences. 2 boys. Margaret murmured, her voice cold and calculating as she stared at the report in her hands. The investigator's photographs of Cole and Owen glared back at her, 2 strikingly familiar faces, their resemblance to Alexander undeniable. Her lips curled into a faint smile, the edges of her satisfaction tempered by disdain. She dismissed the file onto her ornate desk and glanced toward a family portrait on the mantel. Hazel's cherubic face stared back at her, framed by Serena's proud but weary smile. Margaret's own expression in the photograph was poised perfect, an illusion. She no longer cared to maintain a daughter, she scoffed. Under her breather tone dripping with disappointment, Hazel was an afterthought, a placeholder in a lineage that demanded strong male. He's Cole and Owen were different. They were the future of the Blackwood legacy, and Margaret was determined to bring them into the fold. Whether Elena Hart agreed or not, Serena Whitfield Blackwood had grown used to the quiet battles that played out in the Blackwood household. Margaret's sharp remarks disguised as advice, Alexander's distracted silences, the constant suffocating weight of expectation. It all felt like an endless performance, and Serena had been cast in a role she never auditioned for. But lately the veneer had started to crack. She first noticed Margaret's sudden interest in Alexander's business trip to Chicago. The questions were subtle but pointed. The tension between them shifted when Margaret returned from a private meeting, her usually composed demeanor replaced by a razor-sharp focus. "What's in Chicago, Margaret?" Serena asked one evening, her tone casual but probing. As they sat in the parlor, Margaret's smile was tight. "Dismissive opportunity," she replied, "for Alexander, for the family. That's all you need to know." Serena's unease deepened over the following weeks. Margaret's disdain for Hazel became more pronounced, her remarks cutting deeper than before. Perhaps if she were more disciplined, Margaret mused once after Hazel spilled her juice another time. "A shame she's not a boy. The Blackwood needs stability." The implications stung, but Serena's growing frustration turned into resolve. Hazel wasn't Margaret's pawn. She was going to let her daughter herself be molded into something they weren't. The plane touched down in Chicago, and Margaret stepped into the city with purpose. The limousine pulled up in front of Elena Hart's modest apartment, a stark contrast to the Blackwood estate's grandeur. Margaret stepped out, her tailored coat pristine, her expression as frosty as the January air. Elena Hart watched her approach from the window, a sense of foreboding settling in her chest. Ethan Lawson stood behind her, his hand in her shoulder. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, his voice steady. Elena Hart nodded, her gaze unwavering. Yes. Margaret's knock was precise, and Elena Hart opened the door to meet her former mother-in-law's piercing gaze. "Elena Hart," Margaret said smoothly, her tone almost cordial. "We need to talk." Ethan Lawson stepped forward, his presence a quiet boot-soled wall. Margaret's eyes flicked to him, briefly dismissing him as one might a piece of furniture. "I see you've moved on," she said, her voice edged with mock civility. Elena Hart declined the invitation. "What do you want?" Margaret stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning humble space with thinly veiled disdain. "Cole and Owen," she said bluntly. "They belong with their father's family." Elena Hart's breath caught, but she refused to let Margaret see her falter. "They belong with me," she said firmly. "They've always belonged with me." Margaret arched an eyebrow, her expression almost amused. "And you've done admirably given your circumstances, but let's be realistic." Elena Hart, the Blackwood name offers theme opportunities you could never dream of. Elena Hart stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. "You don't get to decide what's best for them. You didn't care about them when I was pregnant, and you don't care about them now. You only care about what they can do for you." Margaret's smile wasn't, her eyes gleaming with cold calculation. "Don't be naive. You think your little life here is enough for them. What happens when they start asking questions, when they realize what they're missing? They're missing nothing." Ethan Lawson interjected, his voice calm but firm. "They have a mother who loves them, and a life filled with stability. That's more than any title or name could give them." Margaret's gaze shifted to him, her disdain sharpening. "And who are you to involve yourself in family matters?" "I'm someone who cares about them," Ethan Lawson said evenly, "and someone who won't let you bulldoze over Elena Hart or her sons." Margaret's compose cracked for a moment, her lips thinning into a harsh line. She turned it back to Elena Hart, her voice colder than ever. "This isn't over. You can't keep them from their birthright." Elena Hart's heart pounded, but her resolve didn't waver. "Watch me." Margaret's departure was as swift as her arrival, the door closing behind her with a sharp click. Elena Hart exhaled shakily, leaning into Ethan Lawson's steady presence. "She won't stop," she murmured, her voice trembling. "No." Ethan Lawson agreed, his hand warm against her back. "But neither will we, the Blackwood." Mansion loomed in its usual oppressive grandeur as Alexander stepped through the front door. The weight of his return to New York pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had barely set down his briefcase when Serena appeared in the hallway, her arms crossed and her gaze sharp. "Margaret went to Chicago, didn't?" Serena's voice was calm, but there was a steeliness beneath it. Alexander froze, his jaw tightening. "Who told you?" "Hazel heard her on the phone," Serena said, stepping closer. "Margaret wasn't exactly subtle about her plans to secure the family's future. I know she went after Ela Hart and your sons." Alexander winced at the words, his hands clenching into fists. "Serena, you knew." Serena interrupted, her tone colder. "Now you knew about them, about her, and you didn't think I deserved to know." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. The exhaustion etched across his face made him look older, more worn. "I didn't know until I went to Chicago," he admitted, his voice low. "I saw Elena Hart. I saw Coley and Owen. I know they're mine." Serena blinked, her composure faltering. "And you just kept this from me, from all of us." "I didn't know how to tell you," Alexander said, his voice cracking, "but I couldn't stop. Margaret, she's only thinking about the Blackwood name, not what's best for anyone." Serena stared at him for a long moment before speaking, her voice quieter, but no less firm. "You'd better figure out what's best for you, Alexander, before it's too late." The atmosphere in the Blackwood mansion was tense, charged with unspoken words and growing resentment. Serena sat in the parlor, Hazel playing quietly on the floor. The sound of Alexander's footsteps in the hallway made her shoulders tense. She had waited long enough. "Alexander," she called, her voice calm but resolute. He hesitated in the doorway, then stepped inside, his gaze wary. "What is it?" "Serena," she stood, crossing her arms. "We need to talk about Chicago, about Margaret, about everything." Alexander sighed, thought of the past weeks pressing heavily on him. "Serena, I already told you." "No," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "You didn't tell me anything. You avoided truth until there was no way to hide it. Margaret's actions, the boys, Elena Hart, of everything, and you let it happen." Alexander's shoulders slumped, but he didn't defend himself. "I didn't know how to handle it," he admitted, Serena's voice cracked with anger. "Of course you didn't, because you spent your entire life letting Margaret dictate every move you make, and know she's dragging Hazel and me down with you." Alexander flinched, his guilt plain on his face. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Serena's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "You knew what Margaret was planning, and you did nothing to stop her. Hazel is just a part of her, and you've allowed it, and now you expect me to stay and pretend everything is fine." Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth of her accusations weighed too heavy. Serena took a deep breath, her voice softening, but losing none of its resolve. "I'm leaving, Alexander. I'm taking Hazel, and we're starting over somewhere. Margaret can't control us. Somewhere you can't." Leather Alexander's heart sank. "Serena, please, don't do this." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've left me no choice. I've tried to be patient, to protect Hazel from this toxic family, but I won't let her grow up thinking she's not enough just because she's not what Margaret wanted." Alexander stepped forward, his voice pleading. "Serena, I can change. I'll talk to Margaret. It's too late." "Alexander," she said firmly, "I can't keep waiting for you to prioritize us over her. Hazel deserves better. I deserve better." The following morning, Serena packed quietly, her movements deliberate and careful. Hazel sat on the bed, clutching a small stuffed bear, her big eyes watching her mother with a mix of confusion and sadness. "Are we going on adventure, Mommy?" Hazel asked softly. Serena knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "Eyes, sweetheart, a big adventure, just you and me." Hazel smiled faintly, innocence in her expression breaking Serena's heart. She hugged her tightly, whispering a promise to herself to give Hazel a life free from the suffocating grasp of the Blackwood name. Alexander stood in the foyer as Serena descended the grand staircase with their suitcases into tow. He looked at her, his eyes pleading, but he didn't stop her. He knew he had no right. "Goodbye, Alexander," she said quietly, her tone devoid of malice but heavy with finality. Watched as she walked out the door, Hazel's hand in hers. The sound of the car engine starting and fading into the distance was the only thing that broke the silence. The knock on Elena Hart's apartment door was sharp and deliberate. Ethan Lawson's brows furrowed as he glanced toward Elena Hart, who stood, frozen, her hand tightening around a dish toe. "Shouldn't need to ask who it was. I'll get it," Ethan Lawson said, stepping forward. "No." Elena Hart whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I'll handle her." Margaret Blackwood stood on the threshold, her tailored coat, impeccable hair, expression as cold as the Chicago winter outside. "Elena Hart," she said smoothly, her tone laced with feigned politeness. "May I come in?" Elena Hart stepped outside, closing the door behind her to shield Cole and Owen from Margaret's presence. "We don't have anything to discuss," Elena Hart said firmly, folding her arms. "Oh, but we do," Margaret replied, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Those boys are Blackwoods. They deserve the opportunities this family can provide." Elena Hart's eyes narrowed, her voice rising. "They deserve a life where they're loved for who they are, not what they represent to someone like you." Margaret tilted her head, her expression almost amused. "You really think this small life you've built is enough for them?" With your companion, Herges flicked dismissively to the closed door, playing the role of father. "Don't be naive." Elena Hart stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. "You don't get to decide what's enough for my children. You don't get to come here and act like you care about them. They're not pawns in your power games, Margaret. They're my sons, and they're staying with me." The door opened behind Elena Hart, and Ethan Lawson emerged, his presence solid and calm. "She's made herself clear," Ethan Lawson said, his voice firm. "You should leave." Margaret's composure cracked, her lips thinning. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her cold arrogance faltering. "The Blackwood name enough." The voice came from behind her, and Margaret stiffened. Alexander stood at the base of the apartment steps, his face pale but determined. He rushed back to Chicago after learning that his mother would bother Elena Hart. "Mother, let it go." Margaret turned sharply, her disbelief evident. "Alexander, this is about the family." "No," Alexander interrupted, his voice steeler than Elena Hart had ever heard. "This is about you and your obsession with control. Let them go." Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, she saw the resolve in her son's eyes, and it unnerved her. With a final withering look, she turned and strode away, her heels clicking against the pavement. When Margaret was gone, the tension between Elena Hart and Alexander was palpable. Ethan Lawson sank aside, his gaze flickering between them before retreating back into the apartment to give them privacy. "Thank you," Elena Hart said after a moment, her voice guarded. Alexander nodded, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "I didn't come here to fight." Elena Hart, I needed to make sure it wouldn't hurt you or them." Elena Hart crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "Why no, Alexander? Why not 7 years ago?" Alexander's shoulders slumped. "Because I was a coward, because I let her dictate my life, and I let you pay the price for it." Looked up, his gaze softening. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Elena Hart, but I don't want a machina there." One Elena Hart's voice wavered with emotion. "What do you want, Alexander?" "I want you to be happy," he said simply. "With Ethan Lawson, with the boys. I don't deserve to be part of their lives, not after everything I've done. But I'd like to be here, even if it's just from a distance, to see them grow up." Elena Hart studied him. Her heart conflicted. The man before her was no longer the Alexander she had known, arrogant, controlled by ambition. He looked broken, remorseful, but there was something else in his eyes. Sincerity. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she admitted, her voice quiet. Alexander nodded. "I don't expect you to. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be someone worth forgiving." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Elena Hart standing on the porch, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and an odd sense of closure. She turned back to the apartment, where Ethan Lawson was waiting with a quiet strength that steadied her. As she entered and shut the door, she sensed the burden of the past dissipating, creating space for life she had tirelessly strived to establish. The sun was warm on Elena Hart's face as she walked hand in hand with Cole and Owen through the park. Ethan Lawson strolled beside her, a soft smile playing in his lips as the boys dashed ahead to the playground. Their laughter rang out bright and carefree, a melody that filled the once empty corners of Elena Hart's heart. "Watch me, Mom," Cole called, climbing the jungle gym with determination. "Be careful," Elena Hart called back, though her smile betrayed her pride. Ethan Lawson leaned closer, his voice low and teasing. "You know he's not going to slow down Elena Hart laughed softly. I know, but it's a mother's job to worry. Ethan Lawson reached for her hand lack. His fingers through hers. And you do it beautifully. Elena Hart experienced a complete release from the burden of her past for the first time in years. She glanced at Ethan Lawson, gratitude and love filling her gaze. This was her family now, a life she had built with resilience and a strength she never thought she possessed back in New York. Alexander sat alone in his study, the Blackwood mansion. Funnaturally quiet. On his desk lay a photo Elena Hart had sent of Cole and Owen at the playground. He traced a finger over their smiling faces, a wistful ache settling in his chest. He glanced out the window at the sprawling estate, its grandeur hollow without the family he had lost. The echoes of Margaret's ambition and his own cowardice reverberated through the empty halls. He was uncertain if the wound caused by Serena's departure would ever heal, and Hazel's laughter had become a distant memory he longed to reclaim. Alexander knew he couldn't undo the years of pain he had caused, but he wasn't willing to lose more. A plane ticket to Los Angeles sat beside the photograph, Serena's last known address scribbled in the corner. For once, Alexander felt a spark of resolve, a determination to try to find Hazel and Serena, to Mac Emmons no matter how difficult the path. Margaret sat alone in the grand parlor, the fire casting flickering shadows on her carefully composed face. She had driven away everyone she claimed to love, Alexander, Serena, and even Hazel's empire she had fought so hard to preserve now felt like an empty monumento. Her ambition reaching for the family portrait on the mantel. She ran her fingers over the timeless faces for the first time in years. Margaret's composure cracked, a tear slipping down her cheek. Legacy she had so fiercely protected had cost her everything. As twilight settled over Chicago, Elena Hart, Ethan Lawson, Cole, and Owen sat on a picnic blanket beneath a canopy of stars. The boys shuttled, closed their eyes wide as Ethan Lawson spun a story about constellations and mythical creatures. Elena Hart watched them, her heart full. The past had scarred her, beauty hadn't broken her. She had found love, laughter, and the kind of joy she once thought impossible. Ethan Lawson turned to her, his voice soft. Are you happy? Elena Hart smiled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Yes, she whispered. I really am. And as the stars twinkled above, Elena Hart knew that this was only the beginning of a brighter, more hopeful future. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.